All right, hi everybody. I'm Amy Leland. I work at Intel. I lead our team that focuses on community advocacy as well as our partner success team.
And my name is Travis Broughton. I'm on Amy's team. I lead our advocacy and governance efforts.
Yeah.
So this morning we'll be talking about open source Lifecycles. We'd like to make this interactive. It's a relatively small room, so you don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. Feel free to raise your hand or come up to the mic as things come up. We'll start out this morning with a few definitions. These are not rigid. They've kind of evolved out of some conversations that we've had with people like John O'Bacon out in the industry. Some of the just ways of thinking about different sourcing or open source models. So the most basic is source available. In the old days, you'd put a tarball out on an FTP site and people could download it, compile it, but there wasn't a whole lot of interaction between the people who published and the people who consumed. Open source is a step forward from that. Typically, the source is shared in a public version control repository like GitHub. They'll maybe accept pull requests, they'll maybe accept bug requests, but the actual architecture, the actual direction of the project remains pretty closely held by a single organization. And then the last piece that we'll talk about is open governance, where there's a group of people from a diverse set of organizations, diverse perspectives that are really driving forward the project. I want to make the case here that open source, there's a lot of folks who think that open source is not the right goal or is not the right objective, that open governance is really the only way to do things. Within Intel, we found that sometimes having a small group of people all within one team can work faster, can come up with minimum viable product or come up with a proof of concept quickly, and then we can use that to seed discussion out in the industry. So each of these models has their place, and we'll walk through a few different examples. Amy will talk about Kata containers, and then we'll talk about a few other projects as well.
And as Travis said, feel free to ask questions along the way. We want it to be an interactive discussion, so if you have questions, feel free to go to the mic, and we'll address it when you have them. So in, I guess, 2014 is really when containers were starting to gain some traction in the industry. And really there was, it was about disruption. Container technology has been around for a really long time, but I think what was new in this space is obviously all of the tools that Docker provided and in making sure that people can consume them and use them in a more effective way. When we started Clear Containers, it actually was born out of a project that we have at Intel called Clear Linux. And we hosted it on GitHub. We open sourced the code. The code was available. People could contribute to it on GitHub, but it wasn't under a neutral governance. And we had a lot of interest from customers and partners. We worked with them on POCs, but there was a general concern around, okay, Intel is really the only one working on this project, right? And so I think there was limitations there. The other thing that was going on when I guess I talk about disruption was that, under disruption, you always see a ton of new things popping out, right? Like when there's something that new technology comes out, you see multiple different projects trying to solve the same problem. And you've seen this probably within the cloud native space, right? There's, especially when Docker first came out, there were so many different technologies around containers, and it was really hard to pick. Like, okay, do we go and make Clear Containers integrated with Docker Swarm, or do we go and integrate with Kubernetes because that's new? And at that moment, it was really, it was a challenge, and we did have to make some bets in terms of, okay, we can't go and integrate with every single new technology that's out there. So which ones are the right ones to choose to make sure that we're, gaining adoption? And as I said before, with clear containers, I guess, and I'll talk a little bit about this in more detail in a few slides, but there was some clear decision points around, when we were going to be moving to open governance. So we had done some POCs with a bunch of different partners, and the approach in general around container security was catching on. And I guess as a show of hands, how familiar are all of you with what Kata containers and what clear containers is? Are you familiar with it? Does everybody really understand? So I'll just quickly go through it because we don't have a slide about it in here, but Kata, or clear containers, was solving an industry problem around container security. And what we did was look at, okay, you've got virtual machines on this side of the spectrum that have been around for a long time and are generally accepted as being secure, and containers on the other side of the spectrum, which are not new, but a new thing, right, when container disruption came around, but generally had a lot of security concerns. And so what we did was say, can you have the best of both worlds? Can we make a virtual machine as lightweight and as fast as container technology, while still plugging into all of the goodness that containers are bringing with, the ease of use, the speed, the pluggability. And so that's what we did with clear containers. And that was the first iteration of it. And again, when we got to this point of, okay, we've worked with all these partners, we've done all these POCs, but at some point we can't continue to push the effort on our own anymore. We have to gain wider adoption, to actually move further, we have to go make this an industry effort. So a lot of the time, I talk about the way that we did clear containers in the beginning was we proved out a technology concept and we readied the industry to test and prove if that was something that was going to be generally accepted. And once we had an indication that it was something that people were interested in, that's the point in which we chose, okay, let's actually take this out and move to open governance so that we can make it an industry initiative. And so that's when we looked around and said, okay, who else is doing something similar to what we're doing in clear containers? And how can we not add to the already fragmented space? And so Hyper actually was doing something very, very similar at the time. And we started talking to them. How can we work together? How can we solve similar problems? And I think we started talking to them in the beginning of 2016. And so we had already been working together on kind of trying to make sure that we had integrated or similar upstream components. So by the time that we were starting to move to open design and open governance, we had already had those conversations with Hyper. And when we decided to join efforts, again, we did it so that we weren't adding fragmentation to the industry. And so in December of 2017, we worked with the OpenStack Foundation, and I think I talked about this earlier in the week, but one of the reasons why we worked with OSF is because, they actually wanted to work with us on a, I guess minimum viable governance model where we didn't have to have, huge boards or really complex membership, but that we really were focused on code first, and we focused on, the technical contribution. So even today in Kata containers, the governing structure, and we'll go through this in more detail, but is really just the technical committee. There's not necessarily a overall governing board. There's just a technical committee and focused on those technical contributions. There's also a working committee, and that working committee is really focused on getting other shit done in the community. So if there is, we didn't want to have a bunch of people who weren't actually really working in the community and doing things. Like if we didn't want to have, I guess, a complex hierarchy in our governance model. And so that's part of the reason why we came to OSF, is because they really worked with us on building the right model for Kata containers. And you had some points that you wanted to make around just the overall foundation.
Yeah, so when we came in, when we approached the foundation about this, Jonathan and Mark pulled folks from Intel and folks from Hyper together with people from the foundation in Austin. We met up, had face-to-face meetings, and that was super helpful. It brought us all to a neutral location. So, it wasn't Intel hosting Hyper, it wasn't Hyper hosting Intel. We were all working together, on level footing. And Jonathan was very, very helpful in forming rich architecture discussions, having architects and Hyper's architects working together, drafting what the to-be state would look like that took the best of what we had, the best of what they had, and really came to a solution that everyone could be happy with. And then Mark was very, very helpful in keeping us grounded in what is Kata containers versus what is the old Intel solution, what is the old Hyper solution, and making sure, when we were having conversations, when someone would just say the word this, Mark would push back, what does this mean to you? Is this the new open source thing? Is this the old thing that may not exist anymore? And really making sure that we were working together in the spirit of a community even before the community was fully founded. So that was really helpful in getting us off to a good start and setting a really solid foundation for governance going forward.
Yeah. So again, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but again, we focused on a lightweight governance, getting away from this whole kind of pay for play, and getting away from really driving this from a membership perspective, where we focused is really from a code perspective, what's the right thing to do, how do we solve challenges, within the container ecosystem, and how do we do that as lightweight as possible, and focus on merging code and reducing fragmentation. So this is a pretty complex slide, but out of all of the things that we did within Kata containers, we kind of started looking at, okay, what is our open source lifecycle, and how do we look at our open source lifecycle within Intel? And I think Travis touched on this a little bit, but sometimes when we open source code, the whole point of open sourcing code and not going to open governance right away is because we do see the value in testing out the idea first and seeing if it's going to stick. Sometimes in the past, we've gone to open governance too quickly, and I would even argue that when we first launched Kata containers, and we launched it at KubeCon, it was like KubeCon 2017, and we had just started doing open design with Hyper, and we talked about it, hey, we're merging this code base, but we also weren't necessarily ready yet for everyone within the community to also get involved in that code base. I think there's this point at which you find a sweet spot of when you're ready to actually have contributions. And the reason for that, and I know that there's probably some people who disagree with me, and that's totally okay, but what we have found is that sometimes, again, if you go to open governance too quickly, that you sometimes don't actually get off the ground and get running, and I guess get to offer a solution, because sometimes having too many people involved up front ends up slowing the process down, and then it not getting traction, and then it doesn't actually become this industry effort that you intended it to become in the first place. So, I think that's a debate, and it's debatable in terms of what is the right thing to do. And I think, again, every project is unique, and every project has different reasons for doing different things. I mean, there's absolutely times where we, at Intel even, will open source code and go to open governance right away. And we'll go through an example of that in a later section today. But yeah.
So I was just wondering if one of the factors on how to make a decision around the timing of that has to do with the size of the project. It seems to me that something that's fairly small and self-contained, you could go to open governance right away. Whereas something as extensive as Kata containers, you would need to spend more time in closed governance before you really had enough to let more cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, and I haven't, it's a really good point. I haven't necessarily thought through as much of the size piece, and I think that's I mean, there's absolutely, you should take that into account. I think that's something that, yeah, it's a really good point. In terms of, at least for us, the way that we kind of think about it is that in phase 1A, we try to get to, okay, who are the companies that are early innovators, and what is the percentage of those companies in the industry? And at some point, and I'll go through this in the next slide, but at some point in phase 1A, there's a decision point of, okay, do we have enough traction in the industry to go to open governance? In every single one of these phases, so it's, launch open source code, launch open governance, build and accelerate the community. I think phase 2 is always the case. Like, even if you just open source code and you don't move to open governance, I mean, anytime that you have code that's open, I think that you should be working on building your community. So even if you don't go through every single phase, building community is always important. And then there's a third phase, and this might make more sense when I get to the next slide, but where the project has gained traction. I mean, if you look at the technology adoption curve, it's gotten enough traction and there's enough interest that really the point of the work that you do in the project is really to sustain your leadership. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. The way that we think about this, and when we're kind of moving through each phase, and the way that at least we gauge kind of, okay, where are we at, and where are there, I guess, checkpoints, right, with adoption and with the industry, is, okay, when we're in phase 1A and once we've open source code, we again work with our partners and our innovators, and that's really just 2.5% of the market, right? And then at some point between working with innovators and early adopters, that's when you kind of say, okay, at what point if we do not move to open source, will that inhibit that growth of that project, right? And most of the time it does. Like, most of the time you can't continue to go through the rest of the phases until you've moved to open governance. So we absolutely believe that open governance is the right approach, but again, there's some times where it's like there's different goals of a project, and it just ends up being that the code is, I mean, we've just open source code. And so, yeah, when we move into kind of phase 2 and build and grow, this is where I was talking about, measuring, hey, how much of the industry in terms of the serviceable available market is actually using this technology? How much of the market is productized this technology? And once you've kind of hit probably past like midway through the late majority, that's when you know that a project is really in this sustaining mode. And you can see that even when you're in sustaining mode, there's usually new innovations that come out of that project. You're focusing on, solving different challenges.
So now you've heard the sort of the backstory of Kata containers. That brings us up to today. As I think everyone now knows, Kata containers was confirmed in a recent board meeting. This is the Kata containers mission statement, and really this one of the things that struck me when Eric and the team were presenting this to the board was how much this really embodies the 4 opens. They really have, the Kata team has really focused on working together openly, building a global community, and they've moved to adopt, or to fully elected seats in the technical committee. So now everyone there is selected from or elected from the community. No one is still selected, which is super important. And then the other thing that they've done, Amy didn't really speak to this in the latter part of our life cycle, but one of the things that they've started to do that's indicative of them being a mature, more sort of late stage project is that they're starting to kick off new technologies. There's new innovation that's happening in Kata containers that's now seeding things that are going straight to open governance because we've built that community, and people from within that community are having those rich conversations, talking about how to solve problems and maybe spinning off new projects like the Rust VMM that are driving the technology forward in new initiatives. So today, Kata Containers has contributions from individuals who are employed by at least 20 companies. There's cross-community collaboration across the OpenStack community, the CNCF, and some other unaffiliated projects like AWS's Firecracker. And they're receiving infrastructure contributions from 5 public cloud operators. So they're doing extensive testing throughout the ecosystem, which is really important. So now that we've talked about Kata, we'll talk briefly about a couple more projects that we've worked on that continue where we've taken what we've learned from Kata and applied that same sort of life cycle. So the first one that I'll talk about is Acorn. For this being, how many of you have heard of Project Acorn? Okay, good. Well, for those of you who haven't heard, it's a lightweight hypervisor built with functional safety in mind. So it's more on the device side of things, not so much the cloud and infrastructure side, but it works alongside projects like Starling X to provide end-to-end device-to-edge to cloud types of data flows. It's followed a similar trajectory as Kata containers, although I think in the case of Acorn, the phase of open source but not open governance was really short. We moved that really quickly into hosting it at the Linux Foundation. We work with a number of different foundations. In this case, as Mark said in his interview the other day, the OpenStack Foundation is really focused on open infrastructure. They're focused on the infrastructure components. Acorn is more, as I said, device side, so it made more sense to go under the Linux Foundation alongside projects like Zephyr that work on the devices. And as we launched and since launch, we've been joined by a number of supporting companies. So the community is growing. It's earlier stage, I think, than Kata. It's not as widely adopted. There's not as wide a participation. Some of that may be because it's so new. Some of it may be because we focused on getting to open governance faster. We didn't work as much on readying the ecosystem because there were a few partners who were really wanted to see the technology, but they did not really want to see a technology that was only driven by one company. They wanted something that was a community effort, and so we moved to make it a community effort in support of that. The last project I'll talk about today is Starling X. That I assume everyone here, anyone not know of Starling X? Okay. So that one has a much longer sort of prehistory, if you will, than Kata containers did. It was initially it was a collaboration that we did with Wind River. It was a Wind River product for years before it moved to open source. So it had a lot of history with the foundation, with the community, and launching it at that late stage presented us with its own unique set of challenges. We launched it last year at OpenStack Summit Vancouver, and as you heard in Melissa's keynote on Monday, we've worked really hard in that community to get rid of the technical debt, to make it more in lockstep with the upstream OpenStack project, and we're no longer really carrying any of that technical debt. We're just pulling forward some patches, some functionality that will be available and trained to an otherwise Stein-based release. And we're working within the OpenStack Foundation. We're collaborating out in the open. One of the things that we did with Starling X, and dropping the code was just the first step. We and Wind River, for a time, were the primary two projects that we're working on this project. And it would have been really easy for our two companies to have just had closed-door meetings and to have worked through things. But working with Claire and Ildiko and the rest of the foundation folks, they really encouraged us to make sure that we were having public meetings. So we stopped having any sort of just Intel Bridge type meetings. We were using OpenStack Foundation Zoom meetings and really making sure that the community, even if nobody else was showing up, they could. We were logging the things in Etherpads, and we were making sure that we had the infrastructure set up so that there wasn't anything happening behind closed doors. But again, just dropping the code is just the first step. I really like this model because it kind of shows how much more effort there is after that. We're still early days. We've established governance. We are not yet elected. We've got a set of elected seats coming up later this year, next month, I believe. So we'll start with TSC elections, and then we'll be continuing to work on growing the user base and increasing the diversity of contributions so that we, like the Kata Containers project, really embody the four opens and can make a strong case for confirmation for this project. So Intel being the company that we are, we love our acronyms. We have something we call BKMs, best known methods. It comes from our manufacturing heritage. But the idea here is just we give each other best practices that we share, and so we'd like to share a few with you. As part of our team, Nicole from my team is hosting a regular office hours meeting where twice a month we have an hour just dial-in bridge where anybody in the company can dial in. Anybody who's working in open source can dial in, get some mentoring. We have skills presentations where people from our team or people from other open source upstream contributors can dial in and talk about a project that they've done, walk through some BKMs that work for them. We'll have new projects that are just starting the process come in and ask questions of how do I do this? We have another more legal governance type of a forum. We call it the Open Source PDT, where we have people dialing in and they have a set of check marks that they have to follow before they are able to release code open source to make sure that we keep Intel legal. We're growing in a spirit of open by default. So it used to be a kind of an uphill battle for us. If we wanted to open source something, there were a lot of questions about, well, what about the competitive advantage? What about this? What about this? Now it's more, we're going to open this, tell us why we shouldn't. And that's been a very fruitful set of changes that have allowed us to be a lot more open and to open source a lot more of the things that we're working on. And lastly, related to the office hours and to the open by default, we've adopted internal inner source practices. We adhere to a compliant code of conduct. We make sure that the things that we're doing in our GitHub, even our private GitHub repositories, are things that are not going to be foreign to people who will join us later. We don't want to set up any artificial barriers to being able to have full community contribution later on down the road.
One thing I would just add is the playbooks that we've written with help from Jono Bacon, and they are aligned to some of the phases that we talked about. So I think we provide those playbooks to the rest of the company to I guess help them understand, okay, what do you think about in each phase of the project? What are some questions that you should run through? What are some questions that you should ask yourself, things to think about, and best known practices? And we have those for prior to releasing open source code, like how do you prepare your code to be open source? Then when you go to open source, when you go to open governance, how do you build your community? And then also how do you make sure that you're sustaining your community leadership, and how do you stay engaged once you've gotten to kind of that later phase? So, you know, in kind of wrapping things up, in any open source solution that we create, we try to solve a challenge. And that, I mean, it's either solve a challenge or create a new innovation. And part of why we do open source first before a lot of times we move to open governance is because we want to make sure that we've tested and made sure that this is actually a viable challenge to solve, and that, you know, the industry actually values what we're putting out there. We try not to create additional fragmentation. We want to partner and merge, you know, where we can within the industry. I believe, you know, launch timing is critical. Thinking through, is the industry ready for this? How am I measuring, you know, when to go launch something? And then also, you know, we do believe in, I guess, governance or open governance models, and we try to strive to move to that phase with every single open source project that we work on. So we did have a couple of questions. I guess in a show of hands, how many people here have similar, I guess, open source models in your companies? Only a few. And if we're looking at taking the playbooks that we've created for internal and bringing them to the community. So is there interest in us releasing some of this out on GitHub for others to actually use and okay, great. Sorry?
Yeah.
To-do group, yep. Is there other questions? Yeah.
Do you have anything about kind of bringing a company that doesn't traditionally do a lot of open source stuff into kind of, you know, encouraging that more and you know, getting people involved and trying to, you know, figure out how to open source some of the stuff that you've had?
We definitely have content. We haven't necessarily created a playbook yet, but if that's something that would be valuable, I think it's absolutely something that we can look into at least pulling together some content on.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you all. I guess we've got the room for a few more minutes, so if you want to come up to the front and ask any questions, we'll be here.
Yeah. Thank you.